Some truths are not written in books of law or history. They are etched in the hard lines around an old man's eyes, carried in the slump of his shoulders, and inked into his skin in faded blue-gray patterns that speak of jungles, monsoons, and promises made in the dark. Honor is one such truth. It has a weight, a mass that can feel heavier than any rucksack, and a value that cannot be calculated on a spreadsheet. Yet, in the cold, transactional world of glass towers and digital ledgers, this weight is often mistaken for a burden to be shed, a relic to be sold. The American Legion Victory Post 778 was a museum of such truths. It smelled of stale beer, lemon-scented disinfectant, and the faint, lingering ghost of cigarette smoke that had seeped into the wood paneling decades ago. The lights hummed a low, weary tune, casting a jaundiced glow on the rows of framed photographs. Young men in crisp uniforms staring out with the clear, unburdened eyes of boys who had not yet seen the world they were sworn to defend. Samuel Peterson sat at a small table in the corner, a glass of water sweating onto a worn coaster in front of him. He was a man carved from old oak, his frame stooped but not broken, his hands gnarled by age and hard work. A network of fine lines crisscrossed his face, a roadmap of 74 years lived with quiet dignity and profound loss. His flannel shirt was clean but frayed at the cuffs, his jeans worn thin at the knees. He nursed his water, making it last. A beer was a luxury he had not afforded himself in months. He was a ghost here, too, in a way. A living relic among the ghosts on the wall. The younger veterans, the ones from Iraq and Afghanistan, were polite. They called him sir, offered him a seat, but their eyes slid past him. They saw a frail old man, a relic from a different war, a different world. They did not see the boy in the photograph on his small, dusty mantelpiece at home. A boy with a lean face and a defiant jaw, standing in front of a Huey, the air thick with the promise of violence. The VFW was his sanctuary and his torture. It was the only place he felt a flicker of the brotherhood that had once been the sun in his sky. But it was also a constant, stabbing reminder of everything he had lost. His team, his youth, his wife, Mary, whose photograph he kept tucked in the worn leather of his wallet. Her smile was the last truly warm thing he had known. Her illness had been a long, slow retreat, a war of attrition fought in sterile hospital rooms that smelled of antiseptic and fear. It had taken her, and in the process, it had taken everything else. The savings, the house, his pension checks swallowed whole by a healthcare system that spoke in the cold language of deductibles and copays. He now lived in a small, government-subsidized apartment on the edge of town. It was clean, sterile, and utterly devoid of memory or warmth. It was a waiting room for the end. The only thing he had left of his past, of his honor, were the things he was now forced to sell, piece by painful piece. A shadow fell over his table. "Samuel, my friend," a smooth voice purred. Samuel looked up. Adrian Vance stood there, a shark-like smile plastered on his face. He was a man who seemed assembled from expensive parts, a tailored Italian suit the color of a stormy sky, a watch that cost more than Samuel's car had cost brand new, and shoes polished to a mirror sheen. He smelled of money and something cloying, like expensive cologne trying to mask the scent of rot. Vance fashioned himself a collector, a preservationist of military history. He frequented VFW posts and American Legion halls, a predator circling a watering hole of the vulnerable. "Mr. Vance," Samuel said, his voice a low rumble. He did not invite the man to sit, but Vance pulled out a chair anyway, his movements fluid and proprietary. He owned every space he entered. "I was hoping I'd find you here," Vance said, leaning forward conspiratorially. His eyes, small and dark, darted around the room before settling back on Samuel. "I have a client, a very serious collector in Japan, who is fascinated by the Vietnam conflict. He's willing to pay top dollar for authentic pieces. Significant pieces." Samuel's hand instinctively went to his chest, where the empty space above his pocket felt like a fresh wound. Vance had already bought his silver star and his purple heart. He'd called it ensuring their legacy. Samuel had called it grocery money. "I don't have much left, Mr. Vance," Samuel said, his gaze dropping to his water glass. The shame was a physical thing, a hot coal in his gut. He was selling his soul for scraps. "Oh, I think you do," Vance said, his voice dropping to a whisper. He slid a crisp envelope across the table. Samuel didn't need to open it to know it was filled with $100 bills. A down payment. A lure. The flag, Samuel. The one from your shadow box. The one your unit flew at Firebase Zulu. Samuel's head snapped up, his eyes flashing with a spark of the fire that had long since banked to embers. No, the word was quiet, but absolute. That flag was not a piece of memorabilia. It was a shroud. It had covered the body of his friend, Corporal Jimmy Slick Malone, on the long, quiet flight out of the jungle. It was soaked in sweat, gunpowder, and the sacred blood of a brother. It was not for sale. Vance's smile didn't falter. It just grew sharper at the edges. Everything has a price, Samuel. Your wife's final medical bills, for instance. I happen to know the collection agency is getting aggressive. It would be a shame for a man of your stature to be hounded by creditors. He tapped the envelope. This could make all of that disappear. Think of it as peace of mind. The fire in Samuel's eyes died, replaced by a deep, weary sorrow. He looked at Vance's manicured fingers, at the soulless glint in his eyes, and he felt a profound, bottomless despair. This was the new enemy. Not a soldier in black pajamas with an AK-47, but a man in a silk suit with a contract and a smile. And in this war, Samuel had no weapons. He was out of ammunition, his position overrun. He stared at the envelope. It represented food. It represented keeping the lights on. It represented a temporary reprieve from the shame of the red-lettered notices that filled his mailbox. Slowly, his gnarled hand reached out, the tremor in his fingers betraying the war raging within him. He was about to surrender the last piece of consecrated ground he held. The weight of his honor was crushing him, and this man, this smiling vulture, was offering to lift it for a price. The air in the room seemed to grow thin, the low hum of the lights a funeral dirge. The ghosts on the wall watched him, their young faces a silent, judging jury. He was alone, utterly and completely alone in a world that had forgotten the value of the truths etched into his skin. The ink of his past was fading, and a new, terrible story was being written over it in the language of debt and desperation. The cold, hard truth of America is often found not in the halls of power, but in the quiet desperation of a forgotten hero in the corner of a VFW hall, about to sell his last piece of hallowed ground. The mountains of Colorado were a fortress of silence. They stood indifferent to the affairs of men, their granite peaks scraping a sky of impossible blue. Wind, cold and sharp even in the late spring, whispered through the pines, a sound like the world breathing. It was here, in this vast and lonely wilderness, that Jack Stone had come to disappear. His cabin was a simple, brutalist structure of reclaimed timber and steel, tucked into a fold of the mountainside like a secret. It was a monk's cell masquerading as a home. The floors were bare concrete. The furniture was sparse and functional. A table, 2 chairs, a bed. There were no photographs on the walls, no mementos on the shelves. It was a space scrubbed clean of past and future, designed for the relentless, unforgiving present. Jack moved through this space with a predatory economy of motion. He was a big man, built like a brick wall with a battering ram attached. His shoulders were wide enough to block a doorway, his chest thick, his arms corded with the dense, functional muscle of a life lived at the ragged edge of human endurance. He was a former Tier 1 asset, a ranger who had spent 15 years as one of the sharpest instruments in America's shadow arsenal. His body was a map of that life, a collection of scars and hardened tissue. But the deepest wounds were the ones no one could see. They lived behind his eyes, a perpetual storm in the cool gray irises. They were the ghosts of his team: Miller, Sanchez, Diaz, and most of all, Specialist Mark Fallon, his best friend, the brother he'd chosen. They had died in a firestorm of shrapnel and dust in the Korangal Valley, the Valley of Death. Jack had been the only one to walk away, a fact that was both his survival and his damnation. The guilt was a physical presence, a cold weight in his chest that never left. He had come to the mountains seeking silence. But silence was a luxury the dead did not grant. Their voices were in the whisper of the wind, their faces in the grain of the wood. He was haunted, and he knew it. Beside the cold hearth, a massive German shepherd lay watching him. This was Havoc. Havoc was no mere dog. He was a veteran, same as Jack. a multi-purpose canine, an NPC who had served alongside Mark Fallon. He was a creature of profound intelligence and controlled power. A scar ran from just above his left eye down his muzzle, a pale white line in his dark sable fur, a souvenir from the same blast that had taken his handler. His eyes, a deep, liquid brown, held a wisdom and a sadness that mirrored Jack's own. They were two survivors of the same shipwreck, washed ashore on this lonely island of silence. When Mark died, the army had planned to retire Havoc, put him in a kennel until he wasted away. Jack wouldn't allow it. He had cut through miles of red tape with the cold, unblinking fury of a man with nothing left to lose. He had called in every favor, leveraged every bit of his fearsome reputation. In the end, they had given him the dog. Jack had taken on Mark's last responsibility. He had inherited his friend's partner, his brother's ghost. Their communication was almost entirely nonverbal. A slight tilt of Jack's head, a subtle shift in Havoc's posture. A low whine from the dog that meant the ghosts were walking too loudly in Jack's mind. A gentle pressure from Jack's hand on the dog's massive head, a silent thank you. They were a pack of two, bound by a shared history of violence and loss. Jack pulled on a worn pair of combat boots, lacing them with swift, precise movements. It was time for the patrol. Every day, they walked the perimeter. Miles of it. It was a ritual, a piece of the military discipline that kept the chaos at bay. It was a war of attrition against the mountain, against his own mind. He grabbed a small, battered rucksack from a hook by the door. Inside was water, a medical kit, a protein bar. The essentials. He didn't carry a weapon on these patrols. He was the weapon, and at his side, Havoc was another. As he opened the door, the cold mountain air washed over him, clean and sharp. Havoc rose in a single, fluid motion, his claws making a soft clicking sound on the concrete floor. He moved to Jack's left side, falling into a perfect heel position, his head up, ears forward, scanning the tree line. Ready, always ready. They moved out, their steps synchronized, man and dog, moving as one entity through the vast, cathedral-like silence of the forest. The only sounds were the crunch of their footfalls on the pine needles and the steady rhythm of their breathing. Jack's mind, as always, drifted to the heat, the dust, the metallic taste of fear in his mouth, to the last thing Mark had said to him, a stupid joke about a warm beer waiting for them back at Bagram. The memory was a knife twist. He clenched his jaw, forcing it down, burying it under the cold, hard discipline of the present moment. Look, listen, smell. The mantra of a point man. The mantra of a survivor. The forest was his therapy. Its brutal honesty was a balm. The mountain did not care about his medals or his kill count. It did not care about the ghosts that rode on his shoulders. It simply was. Survive or don't. The rules were simple here. He understood them. It was the other world, the world of quiet desperation and smiling predators, that he could no longer navigate. The civilian world was a labyrinth of unspoken rules and veiled intentions, a battlefield where the enemy was invisible and the objectives were unclear. He had tried. After leaving the service, he had tried to fit in, to be normal. He'd taken a job in corporate security, worn a suit, sat in meetings. It had felt like being suffocated in slow motion. The noise, the pointless chatter, the petty ambitions, it had all been a different kind of hell. So he had retreated. He had taken his ghosts and his dog and come here, to the edge of the world, to wait for an ending. He was a knight without a crusade, a warrior without a war. His skills, honed to a razor's edge, were useless here. His purpose, once as clear and bright as a signal flare, had been extinguished in a blast of fire and dirt thousands of miles away. He was broken. He knew it, not in his body, but in the core of him, in the place where hope and purpose used to live. But he was still capable. Deep down, under the grief and the isolation, the core programming remained. Protect the team. Complete the mission. Stand for those who cannot stand for themselves. It was a slumbering giant, waiting for a signal, a target, a reason to awaken. Havoc stopped suddenly. The dog's body went rigid, a low growl vibrating deep in his chest. His ears were swiveled forward, his nose twitching, sampling the air. Jack stopped instantly, his hand dropping to the dog's neck, a silent command to hold. He scanned the dense woods ahead, his senses flaring to life, His mind instantly swept clean of ghosts and grief. Threat. The single word detonated in his brain. He dropped into a low crouch, his eyes narrowing, parsing the shadows, the patterns of light and dark. He saw it a second after Havoc did. A flicker of movement. The unnatural shape of a man, trying and failing to use the cover of the trees. Jack's isolation was an illusion. The world, with all its noise and its predators, had just found his fortress of solitude, and it had brought its trouble with it. The slumbering giant inside him began to stir. The intersection of two broken worlds rarely happens in a flash of lightning or a clap of thunder. It happens in the mundane spaces, under the flickering fluorescent lights of a place built to honor the past. Jack Stone did not frequent VFW posts. They were repositories of ghosts, and he had enough of his own. But his truck, a vintage Ford F-250 that was more iron than electronics, had blown a radiator hose on a desolate stretch of county road. The nearest town was a 10-mile walk, and the VFW was the first sign of life he'd encountered, a low-slung brick building with a faded American flag snapping in the wind. He needed a phone and a glass of water. It was supposed to be a simple logistical stop. In and out. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Beer, old wood, a history of sorrow and celebration. His eyes, accustomed to the bright mountain sun, took a moment to adjust to the gloom. He saw the bar, the scattering of old-timers, the wall of heroes. A familiar pang of grief and alienation hit him. This was not his place. Not anymore. Havoc, who had been commanded to stay in the truck, would have hated it. The dog's senses would have been overwhelmed by the emotional residue clinging to the air. Jack moved toward the bar, his large frame drawing a few curious glances. He kept his head down, trying to minimize his presence, a shadow moving through a world he no longer belonged to. He just needed a phone. Then he heard the voice. It was smooth, cultured, and utterly out of place, like a silk handkerchief in a bucket of rusty nails. A shame for a man of your stature to be hounded by creditors. Jack's head came up slowly. His gaze locked onto a table in the corner. He saw a man in an expensive suit leaning over an old man in a flannel shirt. He saw an envelope of cash on the table, a lure cast into a pond of desperation. He saw the predatory gleam in the suited man's eyes and the profound, soul-deep weariness in the old man's face. He saw a wolf cornering a sheep. His internal threat assessment matrix, a deeply ingrained piece of his operational consciousness, lit up. The man in the suit, Adrian Vance, was the threat. The old man, Samuel Peterson, was the asset to be protected. The situation was an injustice in progress. Jack didn't move. Not yet. He observed. It was the first rule of reconnaissance. Understand the terrain before you engage. He watched as Samuel's trembling hand reached for the envelope. He saw the flicker of triumph in Vance's eyes. This was the moment of transaction, the point of no return where a piece of a man's soul was being traded for paper. But then something else happened. Vance, in his arrogance, decided to add insult to injury. He noticed the faded tattoo on Samuel's forearm, partially visible below his rolled-up sleeve. It was a strange design, a skull wearing a green beret, but with a cryptic symbol beneath it. "What's that supposed to be?" Vance asked, his tone dripping with condescending curiosity. He gestured at the tattoo with a flick of his perfectly manicured fingers. "Some kind of local biker gang insignia? You should have gotten that covered up. It lowers the tone." A profound stillness fell over Samuel. The tremor in his hand stopped. He slowly drew his arm back. His eyes, which had been full of shame and defeat, now held a different light. It was cold. It was hard. It was the look of a man whose last sacred thing had just been desecrated. "That," Samuel said, his voice dangerously quiet, "is not for you to speak of." Vance chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Samuel. It's just some youthful indiscretion. We all have them. Now, about the flag." That was the trigger. Jack Stone started moving. He didn't storm across the room. He flowed. It was the movement of a predator, a seamless and silent advance that consumed the space between the bar and the table with unnerving speed. The few patrons who were watching didn't see a man walking. They saw a shape detaching from the shadows and materializing at the corner table. Jack didn't speak to Vance. He addressed the bartender, a heavy-set man with a handlebar mustache who had been watching the scene with growing unease. "Glass of water for the man," Jack said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that cut through the room's low hum. It was not a request. It was an order. He placed a $20 bill on the table. "And one for me. He's with me." Vance looked up, startled, his finely tuned senses finally registering the massive presence that now loomed over him. He saw a man who was his physical antithesis. Where Vance was sleek and polished, this man was dense and formidable. Where Vance's eyes were shifty and calculating, this man's eyes were like chipped flint, steady and unervingly direct. "I beg your pardon," Vance said, his mask of civility starting to crack. "Who the hell are you?" "This is a private conversation." Jack's gaze shifted from the bartender to Vance. It was not a glance. It was an acquisition of a target. He didn't answer the question. He didn't need to. His presence was the answer. He simply looked at the envelope of cash on the table, then back at Vance. A single, clear message was transmitted in that look. The negotiation is over. It was a technique he had learned in interrogation rooms in dusty, forgotten corners of the world. The power of silence. The weight of physical dominance. Let the subject's own mind fill in the blanks, and their fear will do the work for you. Vance, a man accustomed to controlling every room he was in through wealth and verbal dexterity, was suddenly adrift. This was a language he didn't speak. This was the primal, physical language of violence, and he was utterly, hopelessly outmatched. He could feel the latent power radiating from Jack, a palpable aura of danger that made the hairs on his arms stand up. He tried to recover, to reassert his dominance. "Look, friend," he began, trying for a tone of masculine camaraderie. "I don't know who you are, but you're interrupting a business transaction." Jack made a small, almost imperceptible movement. He shifted his weight, settling into a subtle vanguard stance, his feet slightly staggered, his center of gravity lowered. It was the ready posture of a man about to unleash controlled chaos. To a civilian, it looked like nothing. To another trained fighter, it was a declaration of war. To Vance, it felt like the air pressure in the room had suddenly dropped. "Walk away now," Jack said. The words were quiet, almost gentle, but they carried the absolute finality of a chambered round. For a moment, Vance's pride warred with his instinct for self-preservation. His face flushed with anger and humiliation. Who was this lumberjack to interfere? But then he looked into Jack's eyes again and saw nothing. No anger, no emotion. Just a flat, gray emptiness that promised a swift and devastating resolution. It was the look of a man for whom violence was not a passion, but a tool. A tool he was prepared to use. Vance's courage evaporated. It fled, leaving behind a cold, clammy fear. He pushed his chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the linoleum floor. The sound was jarringly loud in the suddenly silent room. "This is ridiculous," he stammered, trying to salvage a shred of dignity. He snatched the envelope of cash off the table. "You haven't heard the last of this." He turned and practically fled, his expensive shoes slipping slightly on the worn floor. He didn't look back. The wolf had been chased from the fold, not by a shepherd's crook, but by the silent promise of a bigger, more dangerous predator. The room let out a collective breath it didn't realize it had been holding. Jack remained standing, his gaze following Vance until the door swung shut behind him. Only then did he relax, the subtle tension leaving his shoulders. He turned his attention back to the table. Samuel Peterson was staring at him, his old eyes wide with a mixture of shock, confusion, and something else, a dawning flicker of hope. The bartender arrived with 2 glasses of water, placing them on the table. He looked at Jack with a newfound respect. "On the house," he said, nodding toward Samuel. "Anything for a friend of Sam's." Jack pulled out the chair Vance had vacated and sat down. He pushed one of the glasses toward the old man. He didn't know it yet, but his mission had just begun. The chance encounter was over. The commitment was about to begin. The quiet corner of a forgotten VFW post had just become the new front line. The silence that settled over the table was thick with unspoken questions. Samuel Peterson stared at the formidable man across from him, a man who had appeared like a thunderclap on a clear day and scattered the vultures. He didn't understand. In his experience, help never arrived. Not anymore. Jack took a slow sip of his water, his movements deliberate. He was giving the old man time, letting the adrenaline of the confrontation drain away. He knew the signs of shock and distress. He'd seen them on the faces of civilians caught in firefights, on the faces of his own men after a mission went sideways. "You all right?" Jack asked. The question was soft, a stark contrast to the hard authority of his voice just moments before. Samuel nodded slowly, his throat working. He took a long drink of water, his hand still trembling slightly. "Ah, yes. Thank you." His eyes were fixed on Jack's face, searching. "I don't know who you are, but—" "Jack," he supplied simply. "My truck broke down. Needed a phone." It was a simple, factual explanation that explained nothing at all. It didn't explain why a man like Jack would intervene, why he would stare down a snake like Adrian Vance for a complete stranger. "That man, Vance," Samuel started, his voice trailing off. The shame was returning, coloring his cheeks. I needed the money." "I know," Jack said. There was no judgment in his tone, only a flat understanding of the brutal calculus of desperation. He had seen men in war-torn countries sell their dignity for a bag of rice. He understood that survival often demanded a steep price. "What did he take from you?" The question was direct, the question of an after-action report. Samuel flinched, as if the words themselves were a physical blow. "My medals," he whispered. "My silver star. 2 purple hearts." He looked away, his gaze falling on the faded tattoo on his arm. "He wanted the flag from my old unit's fire base." Jack's eyes followed Samuel's gaze to the tattoo. The skull in the green beret, the strange symbol beneath it. Vance had dismissed it as a biker insignia. Jack knew better. He had spent his life in the closed, secret world of special operations. He was a student of its history, its lineage, its hidden symbols. He had seen that symbol before. In a classified file. In a dusty, leather-bound book in a secure library at Fort Bragg. A book that detailed the history of America's most secret and deniable operations. "MACVSOG," Jack said, his voice barely a whisper. Samuel's head snapped back toward him, his eyes widening in disbelief. The color drained from his face. It was as if Jack had spoken a forbidden word, a name from a forgotten language that only the initiated knew. Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group. MACVSOG. The most highly classified, multi-service special operations unit in the Vietnam War. They were the ghosts of the jungle, the men who ran cross-border operations into Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam. Their missions were so secret that, for decades, the government denied their existence. Their casualty rates were nearly 100%. To have served in SOG was to have been one of the hardest men in a generation of hard men. To have survived was to be a living legend. "How?" Samuel stammered. "How do you know that?" "I was a ranger," Jack said, a simple statement that carried a universe of meaning. It meant he was part of the same tribe, a descendant of the same warrior lineage. He pointed to the tattoo. "Command and Control North. Spike Team Idaho. Am I right?" Samuel stared at him, dumbfounded. He slowly nodded. The last time anyone had correctly identified his unit insignia had been at a classified reunion 30 years ago. He had thought the world had forgotten. He had started to forget himself. This changed everything. Samuel wasn't just an elderly veteran being preyed upon. He was a hero from the shadow world, a brother in the secret fraternity of special operators. And Vance wasn't just a sleazy collector. He was a ghoul feasting on the bones of a giant. The righteous fury that had been a low ember in Jack's chest now ignited into a cold, white-hot flame. This was no longer a random act of kindness. This was a personal affront. This was a desecration of the code he lived by. "This stops now," Jack said. The words were a vow. He stood up. "We're leaving." "Leaving? Leaving where?" Samuel was bewildered. The world was moving too fast. "You're not staying in a place where he can find you," Jack stated. "You're coming with me. I'll get my truck towed to my place. You can stay there. But I can't. I don't have." "It's not a request," Jack said, his voice softening slightly but losing none of its authority. "We take care of our own. That's the rule. Always has been." He helped the old man to his feet. Samuel, for the first time in a long time, did not feel like a burden. He felt protected. He felt like a soldier again, under the command of a man who knew the mission. After arranging for the tow truck with a call from the VFW's landline, Jack led Samuel out to his truck. He opened the passenger door, and as Samuel climbed in, His eyes fell on the massive German shepherd sitting patiently in the back seat. Havoc watched the old man with his intelligent, soulful eyes, then gave a soft, low woof and laid his head down on his paws. It was a sign of acceptance. The ride to the tow yard, and then up the winding mountain roads to Jack's cabin, was mostly silent. Samuel was lost in a past that had been violently reawakened. Jack was planning his next move, his mind a cold, clear machine of tactical assessment. When they arrived at the cabin, the stark simplicity of the place seemed to surprise Samuel. It was the home of a man who owned nothing and was attached to nothing. Jack got Samuel settled in the single spare chair, gave him a bottle of water, and put a thick wool blanket over his lap. "Stay," he commanded gently, the same word he used for Havoc. Then, he moved to a steel footlocker in the corner of the room. He opened it. It did not contain clothes or memories. It contained the tools of his former trade. Tucked under a layer of neatly folded uniforms was a small, hardened Pelican case. He opened it to reveal a satellite phone and a ruggedized laptop. He powered up the sat phone, the small screen glowing to life. He scrolled through a short, encrypted contact list until he found the name. Wheels. He hit the call button. It rang twice before a voice, crisp and digital, came through the speaker. "You know, for a guy who went to the mountains to be a hermit, you call an awful lot," the voice said. There was no preamble, no hello. "I need something, Wheels," Jack said, his tone all business. Marcus Wheels Cole had been a communications sergeant in Jack's Ranger Battalion. He'd been 2 vehicles behind Jack's in the convoy that day in the Karangal. An IED had taken his legs, but not his fight. Now, from a wheelchair in a basement in San Diego cluttered with servers and monitors, he was a ghost in the machine, a digital wraith who could walk through any firewall and uncover any secret. He was Jack's Overwatch, his intelligence network, his connection to the world he had left behind. "Let me guess," Wheels said. "You saw a squirrel that looked at you funny, and you need me to run a background check on its nut-hoarding patterns. Or did Havoc finally convince you to declare war on the local deer population?" "I have a name," Jack said, ignoring the gallows humor that was Wheels's trademark. "Adrian Vance. Poses as an antique dealer, a collector of military memorabilia. I need everything you can find on him. Financials, associates, patterns of behavior. I want to own him." There was a pause on the other end of the line. The joking tone in Wheels's voice vanished, replaced by the focused calm of a professional. He knew that tone in Jack's voice. It was the tone he used when he was on the hunt. "Vance. Adrian Vance," Wheels repeated, the sound of furious typing already audible in the background. "What's the context, Jack? Who'd he step on?" Jack looked over at Samuel, who had drifted into a light, exhausted sleep in the chair, the blanket pulled up to his chin. He looked small, fragile, a lifetime of strength worn away by time and hardship. "He stepped on a giant," Jack said, his voice low and cold. "He's been preying on a MACVSOG veteran. A hero, stripping him of his medals, his history, his dignity. For pennies on the dollar." The typing stopped. For a full 10 seconds, there was only the faint hiss of the satellite connection. When Wheels spoke again, his voice was like ice. "Give me an hour," he said. "I'm going to peel this guy like an onion. And when I'm done, I'll have enough to make him cry for a year." "Good," Jack said. "I'm counting on it." He ended the call and looked back at the sleeping old soldier. The mission parameters were now clear. The enemy had been identified. The network had been activated. The first phase of the operation was complete. Now came the waiting, the brief calm before the storm. And Jack knew, with the chilling certainty of a man who had orchestrated countless such storms, that when it broke, it would be swift, violent, and utterly decisive. The horror was about to be revealed, and with it, the path to righteous justice. An hour in the world of Marcus Wheels Cole was an eternity. It was enough time to dismantle a digital life, to reconstruct it from scattered data points, and to paint a portrait so detailed it was more real than the person themselves. While Samuel slept the sleep of the utterly exhausted, and Havoc lay sentinel at his feet, Jack paced the concrete floor of his cabin, a caged tiger waiting for the signal to be unleashed. The satellite phone on the table was a silent black brick, a dormant beast holding the promise of information that would fuel his rage. He checked on Samuel, adjusting the blanket that had slipped from the old man's shoulder. He saw the deep-set lines of pain etched around Samuel's mouth, even in sleep. He saw the worn fabric of his shirt, the calloused skin of his hands. This was the face of the mission, not an abstract objective on a map, but a living, breathing man who had earned a peaceful end to his days and was being given a hell of poverty and shame instead. Jack's own ghosts were quiet for once, pushed into the background by the sheer, clarifying power of his new purpose. The grief for his team had not vanished, but it had been transmuted. It was no longer just a weight, but a fuel. He would do for this old soldier what he couldn't do for Mark and the others: secure a future. The sat phone buzzed, a harsh, vibrating sound that ripped through the cabin's silence. Jack snatched it up before the second buzz. "Talk to me." Will's voice was different now. The earlier cold anger had been replaced by something else, something grim and heavy. "Jack, this is bigger than you think. Much bigger." "How big?" Jack asked, his knuckles white as he gripped the phone. "Adrian Vance isn't a memorabilia collector," Wills began, the sound of keystrokes a frantic, angry counterpoint to his words. "That's his cover. It's how he makes contact. It's how he identifies his targets." "Targets, plural, Jack. As in dozens. Maybe hundreds. I'm still digging, but the pattern is sickeningly clear. He exclusively targets elderly veterans. Men like your friend Samuel. Men who are financially distressed, isolated, often dealing with medical issues for themselves or a recently deceased spouse." The pieces clicked into place in Jack's mind, forming a picture of systematic, predatory evil. "So the medals are just the foot in the door." "Exactly," Wills confirmed. "It's phase one. He buys their history, earns a sliver of their trust, presents himself as a friend, a benefactor. He plays on their pride, their desperation. Then he moves to phase 2". Jack could hear Wills take a deep, steadying breath. "He's a licensed financial advisor, Jack. Or he was. His license was revoked 3 years ago for unethical practices, but the SEC never pursued criminal charges. He just paid a fine and changed the name of his company. He runs a firm called Patriot Wealth Management. The irony is thick enough to choke on." "What does he do?" Jack's voice was a low growl. "He convinces these men to give him power of attorney. He promises to manage their finances, to consolidate their debts, to secure their VA benefits and pensions. He tells them he can make their money work for them, give them the security they deserve. He uses their trust in a fellow patriot against them." The image was vile, a parasite cloaking itself in the flag. "And then he drains them." Jack finished, the statement flat and cold. "Drains them is too gentle a word, man." Wills shot back, his voice raw with fury. "He liquidates their assets. He reroutes their pension checks and Social Security payments into a web of offshore accounts. He takes out reverse mortgages on their homes and cashes them out. He leaves them with nothing. When the money's gone, he dissolves the power of attorney and vanishes. The collection notices start, the eviction papers are served, and these old heroes are left on the street, wondering what happened." Jack closed his eyes. The scope of it, the sheer, calculated cruelty, was staggering. It wasn't just theft. It was the erasure of a life. It was a second, final betrayal of men who had already given so much. "How many Wheels?" "I've found 37 confirmed victims so far, just in this state. All of them fit the profile. Most lost everything. I'm cross-referencing public records. Jack, at least 5 of them are dead. Died within a year of Vance cleaning them out. Malnutrition, exposure, suicide. The official causes of death are varied, but the root cause is Adrian Vance." The phone felt cold in Jack's hand. This had escalated from a simple injustice to mass murder by proxy. Vance wasn't just a vulture. He was a serial killer who used spreadsheets instead of a knife. "Where is he?" Jack asked. His voice was devoid of all emotion now. It was the voice he used when he was marking a target for elimination. "His firm, Patriot Wealth Management, is headquartered in downtown Denver. Top floor of the Blackwood Tower. Very fancy, very secure. He lives in a gated community in Cherry Creek. A fortress. But that's not where the real business is done. Go on. He has a warehouse. An antique restoration and storage facility on the industrial outskirts of the city. Vance Fine Art and Antiquities, it's where he keeps the memorabilia he collects. The medals, the flags, the uniforms. It's his trophy room. But it's also where his servers are. The real ones. Not the clean ones at his main office. The ones that hold the offshore account numbers, the transaction logs, the real client list, the victim list. It's all there, air-gapped and encrypted. A trophy room of stolen honor. A digital graveyard of ruined lives. Send me the address, Jack said. Jack, listen to me, Wheels said, his voice urgent. This is organized crime. This is FBI territory. You go in there, you're crossing a line you can't uncross. Let me package this. I can have a federal strike team kicking in his door by sunrise. No, Jack said, the word absolute. Sunrise is too late. The law will give him lawyers. It will give him loopholes. It will drag on for years while more men like Samuel suffer and die. He'll hide his money, plead ignorance. Justice for these men won't be a courtroom. It will be restitution. Immediate and total. He was thinking of Samuel, asleep in the chair. If he handed this to the FBI, Samuel might see some money in 5 years, if he was lucky. If he was still alive. The other victims were in the same boat. The system was too slow, too ponderous. It was designed to punish, not to restore. What are you going to do, Jack? Wheels asked, though he already knew the answer. I'm going to conduct an audit, Jack said, his voice like stone. I'm going to force a complete and immediate liquidation of his assets and transfer them back to the people he stole from. With interest, punitive damages, and Vance. He will be a willing participant in the transaction. Jack, that's necessary. Jack finished for him. Send me the schematics for the warehouse. Power, security, entry points. And I need that victim list. All of them. With account numbers where I can send the money. There was a long pause. Jack could picture Wheels in his high-tech basement, wrestling with the implications. He was asking his friend to be an accessory to a dozen felonies. The things we do for our brothers, Wheels finally said, a note of resignation and deep loyalty in his voice. You know, the SOG guys had a motto. You have never lived until you have almost died, and for those who fight for it, life has a flavor the protected will never know. I know it, Jack said. Go give him a taste of it, Jack, Wheels said. Data packet is on its way. Watch your 6-inch. The line went dead. A moment later, the ruggedized laptop chimed. A file transfer was complete. On the screen were blueprints, security protocols, and a long list of names. Each name was a story of a life of service, followed by a story of financial ruin. This was the kill list. But the targets on it were not the ones to be eliminated. They were the ones to be saved. Jack stood up, the decision made, the path clear. The righteous fury within him had cooled, hardening into something far more dangerous, purpose. He was no longer a broken knight. He was a hunter, and the hunt was on. He walked over to his steel footlocker and opened it again. This time, he didn't reach for the electronics. He reached deeper. The time for investigation was over. It was time to gear up. The transformation began. The man who was a quiet, haunted recluse receded, and the Tier 1 operator emerged. It was a ritual, a shedding of civilian skin to reveal the hardened warrior beneath. Every movement was precise, economical, and imbued with a lethal grace. This was muscle memory, a catechism practiced in forward operating bases and sterile kill houses across the globe. First, the clothes. He stripped off the civilian shirt and jeans, revealing a torso that was a testament to a life of brutal physical discipline. A roadmap of old scars crisscrossed his chest and back, each one a paragraph in a violent story. He pulled on a pair of Black Cry Precision G3 combat pants, the fabric durable and flexible. Over his torso went a moisture-wicking compression shirt, the color of night. Next, the tools. From the footlocker, he retrieved a low-profile plate carrier. It was slick, minimalist, designed for speed and mobility. He slotted lightweight ceramic plates into the front and back, not for a protracted firefight, but as insurance against a desperate, lucky shot. Attached to the carrier's maul webbing were only the essentials: 3 spare pistol magazines, a multi-tool, a small breaching charge no bigger than a deck of cards, and a trauma kit. He was not going to war. He was performing surgery, a swift and precise excision of a cancer. He strapped a holster to his right thigh, the kydex molded perfectly to the shape of his weapon. He retrieved the pistol from a locked case. It was a Heckler & Koch 45 Hong Kong dollars, a .45 caliber handgun known for its reliability and stopping power. He worked the slide, chambered around, and engaged the safety. The sound was a crisp, metallic punctuation mark. He slid the weapon into its holster, the click of it seating home a sound of finality. On his other thigh, he strapped a sheath holding his combat knife. It was a Strider SMF, a blade with a fearsome reputation, its edge honed to a razor sharpness. It was a tool for last resorts and silent work. He pulled on a pair of black tactical gloves, flexing his fingers as the leather settled. Finally, he sat on the edge of his bed and pulled on his boots. Not the worn hiking boots he used on the mountain, but his old assault boots, their soles designed for stealth and traction on any surface. As he stood, fully kitted out, he was no longer Jack Stone, the grieving hermit. He was Reaper, his old call sign, a specter of violence, a purveyor of final outcomes. Havoc, who had been watching this entire process with an unnerving stillness, rose to his feet. The dog's body was tense, his ears erect. He knew this ritual. He had seen it countless times before missions with Mark. It was the signal that the hunt was on. A low, eager whine escaped his throat. Jack looked at the dog. "Not this time, boy," he said, his voice low. "You stay? You guard him." He walked over to Samuel, who was still sleeping, and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. The old man stirred, but didn't wake. Jack's hand lingered there for a moment. This was for him. For all of them. He turned to Havoc and pointed at Samuel. "Watch," he commanded. The order was absolute. Havoc whined again, a sound of protest, his eyes pleading. He wanted to go. He wanted to hunt. It was what he was born and bred for. "Stay," Jack repeated, his voice firm. "That's your mission." The dog seemed to understand. The tension in his body eased slightly, and he sat back down on his haunches, his gaze fixed on Samuel. He was on guard duty now. He had his orders. Jack gave the dog one last nod, then turned and walked to the door. He picked up the ruggedized laptop containing Wills's data and slid it into a small, black go bag. He slung it over his shoulder, took one last look around the Spartan cabin, and stepped out into the cold night air. The drive down the mountain was fast and controlled. He pushed the old Ford truck, its radiator now patched with a field-expedient fix, to the limits of its endurance. The winding roads were a blur of asphalt and pine trees under the moon. His mind was a silent, cold space. He was running checklists, visualizing the target location, memorizing the blueprints Wheels had sent. Vance Fine Art and Antiquities was in a soulless industrial park, a collection of anonymous corrugated steel buildings under the orange glow of sodium vapor lamps. It was the kind of place that existed to be forgotten. Jack parked the truck 3 blocks away in the shadows of a defunct tire factory and killed the engine. For 10 minutes, he sat in the darkness, observing. He watched the patterns of the occasional passing security patrol car. He noted the placement of the CCTV cameras on the corners of the building. They were standard, cheap models, their blind spots obvious to a trained eye. He got out of the truck, a silent shadow detaching from deeper shadows. He moved with the fluid, ground-eating stride of a man accustomed to covering ground quickly and quietly. He didn't take the direct route. He flowed along fence lines, through alleys, using the urban landscape as cover. He arrived at the rear of the warehouse. According to Wheels' intel, there was a single, steel door, a secondary alarm contact, and one camera covering the loading bay. He paused in the deep shadow of a dumpster, his eyes scanning the building. The camera was exactly where the schematics said it would be. Its panning motion was slow, predictable. He timed it. 30 seconds left, 30 seconds right. A 5-second blind spot at each apex of its swing. Easy. He waited for the camera to pan away. The moment it reached its apex, he moved. He crossed the 20 feet of open ground in less than 2 seconds, a black blur against the grimy concrete. He pressed himself flat against the cold steel of the building, well inside the camera's blind spot. He pulled the multi-tool from his vest and went to work on the alarm contact box next to the door. The cover came off with a quiet twist. Inside was a simple magnetic switch circuit. He clipped a bypass jumper onto the wires, creating a continuous loop. To the central system, the door was still secure. Next, the lock. It was a heavy-duty commercial deadbolt. A brute force entry would be loud. He had a better way. He examined the frame, finding the small gap between the door and the jamb. He slid a thin, flexible piece of plastic, a door shim, into the gap, working it down toward the lock mechanism. Finding the bolt, He expertly manipulated it, pushing it back into the door. There was a soft, oily click. He didn't knock. He opened the door just enough to slip through and closed it silently behind him. He was in. The air inside was stale, smelling of dust, old paper, and metal polish. The main warehouse floor was a maze of tall metal shelving units, packed with boxes and shrouded shapes. This was the graveyard of heroes. In these boxes were the medals, flags, and uniforms of men like Samuel, trophies of a predator. According to Wheels, Vance was here. His car was in its private garage, and the building's heat and power systems were active. He often worked late, obsessing over his stolen treasures and his digital ledgers. Jack moved down the central aisle, his boots making no sound on the dusty concrete. He was a ghost in this mausoleum of valor. He passed a shelf and saw a display case, carelessly left open. Inside, laid out on black velvet, was a silver star and 2 purple hearts. Samuel's medals. A cold, precise rage settled over him. The office was at the far end of the warehouse, an elevated glass-walled structure that looked down on the floor. A light was on inside. Jack could see the silhouette of a man sitting at a large desk. He took the stairs 2 at a time, his movements still utterly silent. He reached the door to the office. It was unlocked. Arrogance. Vance felt safe in his fortress. Jack opened the door and stepped inside. Adrian Vance was hunched over a large monitor, his face illuminated by the glow of a complex spreadsheet. He was so engrossed in the numbers, in the flow of money from the accounts of the forgotten to his own, that he didn't hear a thing. "You're busy," Jack said. The voice was quiet, but it hit Vance like a physical blow. He yelped, a pathetic, startled sound, and spun around in his expensive leather chair. His eyes went wide with terror and disbelief as he saw the massive, black-clad figure standing just inside his office. It was the man from the VFW. But this was not the quiet, intimidating stranger from the bar. This was something else entirely. This was a nightmare given form. How did you get in here?" Vance stammered, his hand instinctively darting for the phone on his desk. Jack was there in a single step. He placed his large, gloved hand over Vance's, his grip like a steel vise. He squeezed, just enough. The bones in Vance's hand ground together. Vance cried out in pain, his face contorting. "We're not making any calls tonight," Jack said, his voice a flat, cold monotone. He took the phone and crushed it in his grip, the plastic cracking and splintering. He tossed the ruined device onto the desk. "What do you want?" Vance gasped, cradling his hand, his eyes wild with fear. "Money? Take it. Take whatever you want." Jack looked around the opulent office. The walls were lined with more display cases, holding priceless artifacts of military history. A Medal of Honor, carefully lit. A general's dress uniform. All of it stolen, bought from desperation. "Oh, I will," Jack said. He pulled the ruggedized laptop from his go bag and set it on the desk next to Vance's monitor. He powered it up. "But I'm not here to take it for myself." He gestured with his chin toward Vance's computer. "You've built quite an empire here. An empire of stolen honor. An empire built on the backs of men who gave everything." "I don't know what you're talking about," Vance blustered, his fear making him foolish. "I'm a legitimate businessman. A collector. I provide a service." Jack didn't reply. He simply turned the screen of his laptop toward Vance. On it was the list. The list of 37 names Wheels had compiled. Next to each name was a photo, a service record, and a summary of the financial devastation Vance had wrought upon them. The 5 who were dead were highlighted in red. Vance's face went slack. The blood drained from it, leaving a pasty, gray pallor. The last of his arrogance shattered like glass, replaced by a primal, abject terror. He was looking at his entire secret world, laid bare. "This is the part where you stop lying," Jack said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "And this is the part where you start making things right." The face-off was over. The coward had been exposed. Now, the justice would begin. And in the cold, sterile light of the warehouse office, Adrian Vance was about to learn the true meaning of restitution, delivered at the hands of a man who had become the living embodiment of righteous fury. The air in the office crackled with a tension so thick it was almost audible. Adrian Vance stared at the list of names on Jack's laptop, his breathing shallow and ragged. He looked like a man who had just seen his own obituary. His world, so carefully constructed from lies and digital theft, had been breached and conquered. The master of the universe was now a prisoner in his own throne room. This is illegal, Vance whispered, the words absurd in their impotence. You can't do this. Jack leaned forward, his massive frame eclipsing the light from the desk lamp, casting his face in shadow. Only his eyes were visible, glinting like chips of ice. You are going to lecture me about legality? He said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. You, who has bled heroes dry and left them to die in poverty. You, who built this palace of glass and steel with the pension checks of men who fought in jungles you can't even imagine. No, we are far beyond legality now. We are in the realm of consequence. He tapped the screen of Vance's computer. Open your system. All of it. The offshore accounts. The transfer protocols. The master ledger. Vance hesitated, a last flicker of defiance in his terrified eyes. I won't. Jack didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He simply reached out and placed his hand on the back of Vance's neck. He didn't squeeze. He just let his hand rest there, the potential energy in his grip a palpable threat. Vance froze, every muscle in his body locking up. He could feel the immense, controlled power in that hand, the casual way it could snap his spine. You will, Jack said softly, or I will use your head to open it for you. Your choice. The battle of wills lasted less than a second. Vance's defiance crumbled into dust. Trembling, he turned back to his keyboard. His fingers, clumsy with fear, flew across the keys, entering a series of complex passwords. Screens flickered, windows opened. In moments, the architecture of his criminal empire was laid bare on the monitor, a labyrinth of shell corporations, encrypted ledgers, and accounts in the Cayman Islands, Switzerland, and Panama. It was a monument to greed. There, Vance whimpered. It's all there. Jack looked at the screen, then back at his own laptop where Wheels had already mapped out the network. Good. Now, you're going to initiate a transfer. You're going to empty every single one of these accounts and send the money where it belongs. He slid his laptop closer to Vance. Wheels has already set up receiving accounts for every victim on this list. He's also calculated what you stole from each of them. We're going to start with Samuel Peterson. You stole $72,000 of his savings and benefits. You will be returning $150,000 to him. 150. Vance squawked. That's more than double. That's for the pain and suffering. Jack said, his voice flat. Consider it a tax. A fine levied by a higher authority. Now do it. With Jack's hand still resting on his neck, a constant, terrifying reminder of his mortality, Vance began the process. His fingers danced across the keyboard, initiating the international wire transfer. He brought up a confirmation screen. It requires a two-factor authentication code, Vance said, his voice shaking. It goes to my phone. Jack looked at the shattered remains of the phone on the desk. Then I guess you have a problem. A new wave of panic washed over Vance's face. I can't. Without the code, the funds are locked. It's a security measure. Jack pulled out his own sat phone and sent a one-word text to Wheels, 2FA. Seconds later, a reply came back. It was a string of numbers. Jack read them out loud to Vance. Vance's jaw dropped. How? Your service provider is very cooperative when properly motivated, Jack said. Enter the code. Defeated, Vance typed in the numbers. He hit confirm. On the screen, a progress bar appeared. Transfer initiated. 1 down. 36 to go. For the next hour, the office was filled with the frantic clicking of keys and the quiet, authoritative commands from Jack. One by one, Vance's offshore accounts were drained. One by one, the men and women he had ruined were made whole, and then some. The punitive damages Jack levied were steep, a heavy tithe for the suffering Vance had caused. It was a systematic, methodical dismantling of a financial empire. It was justice, delivered not by a gavel, but by a keyboard under the threat of righteous violence. As the final transfer completed, Vance's empire was gone. Millions of dollars, rerouted back to their rightful owners. He slumped in his chair, a hollowed-out man. He was financially ruined. Is that it? He whispered. Are you done? Jack looked at the empty accounts, then at the man. Almost. He walked over to the wall of display cases. He looked at the Medal of Honor, the silver stars, the purple hearts, the soul of 1,000 soldiers, held captive in glass boxes. With a single, swift motion, He swept his arm across one of the shelves. The glass case crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 pieces. He began to gather the metals, his movements gentle now, reverent. He took Samuel's silver star and purple hearts and placed them carefully into a pouch on his vest. "These do not belong to you," he said, his back to Vance. "They were never yours to own." He then returned to the desk. He took Vance's server tower, a black monolith of stored data, and unplugged it. He did the same with the hard drives and backup tapes. He piled them on the floor. "The money is restored," Jack said. "But the evidence of your crimes remains." He looked at the pile of electronics. "This is the part where the authorities get involved." Vance looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. The police, the FBI, they were preferable to this terrifying specter of vengeance. Jack pulled out his sat phone again. He didn't call 911. He dialed a direct number, one that Wheels had provided. A number that went straight to the desk of the special agent in charge of the FBI's Denver field office. "You're speaking to Agent Miller," a crisp voice answered. "Agent Miller," Jack said, his voice low and anonymous. "You are about to receive an anonymous tip. I suggest you write this down. The location is Vance Fine Art and Antiquities. The man you want is Adrian Vance. He is the architect of a multi-state fraud ring targeting elderly veterans. A full data packet, including evidence of wire fraud, elder abuse, and a list of victims, has just been uploaded to your secure server. You will also find that millions of dollars have just been returned to these victims from Mr. Vance's accounts." He paused. "I suggest you move quickly. He is a flight risk." He ended the call before Miller could ask a single question. He had delivered the package. The target was neutralized, his empire destroyed, his future a long, bleak road of federal indictments and prison time. He had not killed him, but he had taken everything that mattered to him. He had left him a fate worse than death, a life without wealth, power, or freedom. Jack looked at Vance one last time. The man was a broken shell, weeping silently in his expensive chair. There was no satisfaction in the sight, only the cold, clean feeling of a mission completed. He turned to the pile of hard drives on the floor. He placed the small breaching charge on top of the server tower. It was just enough to flash fry the electronics, to corrupt the data beyond recovery, but not enough to start a fire. It was a failsafe. The FBI had their copy. This was to ensure Vance's lawyers could never get their hands on it. He set the timer for 2 minutes. Then, he walked out of the office, not looking back. He moved through the silent warehouse, past the shelves of stolen history. He stopped at the display case he had seen on his way in, the one with Samuel's medals. He had already retrieved them from the office, but the sight of the empty velvet still resonated. He was not just returning money. He was returning a man's stolen soul. He slipped out the back door as silently as he had entered, removing the bypass jumper from the alarm panel. He melted back into the shadows of the industrial park. 2 minutes later, a soft, muffled thump echoed from within the warehouse. A faint flicker of light, and then darkness. Far in the distance, the first sirens began to wail, a rising chorus racing toward the scene of the crime. But the justice had already been served. The court of Jack Stone was adjourned. The drive back up the mountain was different. The old truck seemed to climb the winding roads with a lighter spirit. The engine hummed a steady, reliable tune. The weight in Jack's own chest, the cold, ever-present mass of grief and purposelessness, felt lighter. The ghosts were still there, but they were quieter now, their accusatory whispers replaced by a respectful silence. He had found a war he could win. When he pushed open the door to his cabin, the warm, yellow light spilled out into the pre-dawn gloom. The first thing he saw was Havoc, who lifted his head from his paws, gave a soft thump of his tail on the concrete floor, but did not leave his post. He was still guarding Samuel. Samuel himself was awake, sitting upright in the chair, a look of profound anxiety on his face. He had woken up alone in a stranger's cabin with a giant dog for a century, and the fear of the unknown was clear in his eyes. "It's all right," Jack said softly, closing the door behind him. "You're safe." He shrugged off the go-bag and began the ritual of de-gearing. The plate carrier came off, then the holsters, the gloves. The warrior receded, and the quiet man returned. He placed the 45 Hong Kong dollars back in its locked case. The mission was over. He walked over to Samuel, his movements slow, non-threatening. He knelt down in front of the old man, so they were at eye level. Vance won't be bothering you again, Jack said. Or anyone else. Samuel stared at him, his mind struggling to process the information. What did you do? He whispered. Instead of answering directly, Jack reached into the pouch on his vest. He pulled out the medals, their ribbons crisp, the metal gleaming even in the dim light. He took Samuel's gnarled hand and placed them in his palm. The silver star, the purple hearts. Samuel gasped, his fingers closing around the medals with a desperate reverence. He brought them to his chest, holding them as if they were a living thing, a lost child returned home. Tears welled in his old eyes and traced paths through the weathered lines on his face. He didn't try to wipe them away. How? Was all he could manage to say. They were never his to have, Jack said simply. He stood up and retrieved his laptop. He turned it so Samuel could see the screen. It was an online banking portal, logged into the new account Wheels had created. The balance displayed was $150,000. Samuel stared at the number, his eyes wide with disbelief. He shook his head. I don't understand. This isn't possible. It is, Jack confirmed. It's your money. What he stole, and then some. It's yours. All of it. He then showed him the list of the other 36 victims. They've all been repaid, too. Their accounts are full. Vance's are empty. The FBI has him. It's over. The old soldier looked from the medals in his hand to the number on the screen, and then up at the formidable man standing before him. The full weight of what Jack had done, the impossible feat he had accomplished in a single night, began to sink in. He hadn't just been saved from a predator. His honor had been restored. His life had been given back to him. Why? Samuel asked, his voice thick with emotion. Why would you do all this for me? Jack looked past Samuel, his gaze distant for a moment, seeing the faces of Miller, Sanchez, Diaz, and Mark. He saw Havoc's original handler, his brother. Because we take care of our own, Jack said, his voice quiet but firm. It's the only rule that matters. In that moment, a bond was forged between the two men, a bond of shared history, of a rescued and a rescuer, a brotherhood that transcended generations. The gap between the Vietnam veteran and the ranger from the global war on terror vanished, bridged by an act of righteous justice. A few weeks passed. The mountain fortress of solitude slowly transformed. It was still simple, still Spartan, but it was no longer empty. Samuel stayed. At first, it was temporary, until he could find a new place. But the quiet rhythm of the mountain, the companionship of another man who understood the language of silence, and the steadfast presence of Havoc began to heal something in him. He and Jack didn't talk much about the past, but they didn't need to. They would sit on the small porch in the evenings, watching the sun set behind the granite peaks, a comfortable silence between them. Samuel started cooking again, filling the small cabin with the smells of simple, hearty food. He told stories, not of the war, but of Mary, of growing up in a different America, of fishing trips and first cars. He was bringing life back into the sterile space. One morning, Jack was looking at the laptop, at the final report from Wheels. Vance was facing a mountain of federal charges. With the money already returned, the prosecution was focusing on the fraud itself. He would never see the outside of a prison cell again. The report also detailed the surplus funds, the punitive damages that had been collected but not yet allocated. It was a significant sum. Samuel, Jack said, we have a new mission. He explained the situation, the extra money. He proposed an idea, something that had been taking shape in his mind since that night in the warehouse. A way to make the justice permanent. They decided to start a foundation. Not a big, flashy charity, but a small, agile, rapid response organization. Its purpose would be simple: to provide immediate, no-questions-asked financial aid to veterans who had fallen through the cracks, the ones targeted by predators like Vance, the ones drowning in a system that had forgotten them. They would call it the Fallon Malone Fund, in honor of Jack's fallen brother, Mark Fallon, and Samuel's, Jimmy Slick Malone. Wheels, from his basement in San Diego, became their digital commander, finding the people who needed help. Jack became the field agent, the man on the ground. And Samuel, with his lifetime of wisdom and his deep understanding of a soldier's pride, became its heart. He would be the one to talk to the veterans, to let them know they were not alone, that the brotherhood was real and it had not forgotten them. The epilogue of their story was not a single, final image, but a series of quiet, powerful moments unfolding over the next few months. It was a rainy Tuesday when Jack and Samuel drove 3 hours to a rundown motel to meet an 82nd Airborne veteran who was a week from being evicted. They didn't just give him a check. Samuel sat with him for 2 hours, drinking bad coffee and just listening, while Jack quietly paid the man's back rent and set up a fund to cover his expenses for the next year. It was a sunny Friday when Havoc, his tail wagging, gently licked the face of a young Marine widow whose husband's death benefits had been stolen in an online scam. Jack, through Wheels, had clawed the money back from a server in Eastern Europe and put it in a secure trust for her and her children. The cabin on the mountain was no longer a fortress of isolation. It had become an outpost of hope, a command center for a new kind of war. A war against despair. One cool evening, 6 months after the night at the VFW, the three of them, Jack, Samuel, and Havoc, were sitting on the porch. The sun was a fiery artist, painting the sky in strokes of orange, purple, and gold. The air was clean and cold. Samuel was holding his silver star in his hand, not with the pained memory of what it had cost, but with the quiet pride of what it represented. He was no longer a victim. He was a soldier again, with a mission and a team. Havoc lay at Jack's feet, his head on his paws, his deep brown eyes content. He was no longer a grieving partner, but a guardian, a vital member of the pack. And Jack looked out at the vast, silent mountains, and for the first time in a very long time, the silence was not filled with the ghosts of the dead. It was filled with a profound and healing peace. He had found a new squad, a new brotherhood. By saving Samuel, he had inadvertently saved himself. The broken knight had found his crusade. His purpose, which he thought had been extinguished in the dust of the Korangal, had been rekindled, and it now burned brighter than ever. The war was not over. For men like them, it would never be. But here, on this mountain, at the edge of the world, they had won a crucial battle. They had established a beachhead of honor in a world that had forgotten its worth. And tomorrow, they would wake up and continue the fight. Together,